Hi everyone, Samir and Sumit here, and welcome back to our Formula One podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 United States Grand Prix.
Yeah, and so going into this weekend, it was Red Bull has now sealed up both constructors and driver championships. So at this point, they were just looking to break more records and win more races and win more trophies.
Exactly. But however, there were a bunch more battles throughout the lower
Yeah,
parts of the table. We had, for example, the battle at the back of the championship
yeah,
between the likes of Alpha Tauri, Alfa Romeo, Haas, and Williams for
yeah,
that seventh place in the championship.
yeah,
And then also Sergio Perez versus Lewis Hamilton for
yeah,
P2 in the Drivers' Championship. So
yeah.
all of those would be like the main battles going throughout the rest of the season as the championships had already been decided.
Yeah, so going on into FP1, then there were numerous things that came back throughout the rest of the season, such as Daniel Ricciardo made his return to Formula One after his hand injury that set him back like a couple races.
Yeah, so Ricardo now would finally return back to F1 full time after Liam Lawson had to deputize for him starting at Zandvoort where he
Yeah,
broke his hand. So Ricardo was back and it would be interesting to see how he would do now with his healed
yeah.
hand now to see if he could really push for Alpha Tauri to fight up maybe even towards seventh in the championship.
Yeah, and also Logan Sargent with once again another home race for him. Seeing it would be interesting to see how he would do this weekend after he needs or definitely needs some good results to keep his seat next year.
Yep. So going into FP1 now, we already saw a lot of like action in the first part of it where we saw Oscar Piastri go
Yeah,
off the track just before the plunge down the hill
yeah,
before the long straight. And it was like really weird because Piastri just looked like he was going through the corners obviously, and then he just took too much curb on the
yeah,
inside and that sent him wide onto the grass. And he did well to save it though.
yeah. We also saw the likes of Fernando Alonso in his Aston Martin, not having the greatest of sessions, only down there in P18, and both Aston Martins struggling because Stroll was down there in P20 as well. So both Aston Martins definitely had some work to do ahead of them to get back into this session.
Yep. Red Bull had a new special
Yeah,
livery this weekend. It was like sort of stars and stripes on the
yeah,
RB19, and Verstappen with his new crash helmet for his world championship win. He was
yeah.
still flying along in Coda and set the fastest time in FP1.
Yeah. Also, we saw Sergio Perez too in his fierce battle with Lewis Hamilton in the Drivers' Championship. He was behind Lewis Hamilton in FP1. He was in P4 while Hamilton was in P3. So far, not the best start, but Perez was only a tenth off Lewis Hamilton, and we know how strong Hamilton is in the United States as well.
We also saw a lot of traffic throughout this session and
Yeah,
also throughout the weekend. Like for example, we saw one of the McLarens block one of the Ferraris. I think who was it? I think it was Carlos Sainz probably who
yeah,
got blocked by a McLaren. But in the S's too, so that's really
yeah,
dangerous with the high speeds. And we also saw Lance Stroll at the penultimate corner getting blocked by multiple cars and ending
yeah,
up having to go into the pit lane. And
yeah,
Aston Martin, though, this weekend, they had, like, on Stroll's car especially, they were
yeah,
struggling with brakes on the front tires. And so it was really weird because throughout the whole weekend, they seemed to be having consistent braking issues.
yeah. Also, Daniel Ricciardo in his first session back with a special United States Grand Prix livery, he was looking pretty
Helmet.
decent. Yeah, helmet, his United States helmet, but he was looking decent as well. A tenth off his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, and up there in P14, behind Tsunoda who's in P13. So far a pretty decent start for Ricciardo.
Yep. So going into the end of this, the results for FP1, it was Max Verstappen at the top. That probably would be representative of the
Yeah,
whole weekend, but then again, FP1 is really different, like track conditions come race time,
yeah,
and it would be a sprint weekend too, so it would be double the racing action.
yeah,
Then Charles Leclerc came second in the Ferrari, followed by Lewis Hamilton, and then Sergio Perez. So the two P2 title contenders were third and
yeah,
fourth. Then Magnussen was fifth in the Haas at their home race too. So it was a really good effort from Kevin Magnussen.
yeah,
Then came George Russell, Alex Albon, Carlos Sainz, Nico Hulkenberg, and Pierre Gasly to round out the top 10.
Yeah, so now moving on into qualifying then, and this because this United States GP weekend was a sprint weekend as well, just like in Qatar. So once again, qualifying for Sunday's Grand Prix would take place on a Friday. So drivers only had that one practice session to find their setups and find the limit before qualifying. So going into Q1 then, right at the very end, we had a lot of drivers looking to complete their laps and get through into the next part of qualifying. As George Russell crossed the line, he could not improve. He only stayed at P7, which would look like it would be good enough for him. But next to cross the line was Logan Sargent in his home race, and as of now, he had not set a time. And because of the first lap, he didn't set a really good time, and he was down there in P20. But as he crossed the line, he went up into P14. So it was a pretty decent time, but definitely not a very competitive one by the looks of it.
Yeah, and so Sargent he went into 14, and then we waited to see those others could challenge him. And
Yeah,
behind him, Ricardo was fighting towards the line, and
yeah,
Ricardo's 20 at the moment. But then he went up to P10, so that knocked out
yeah,
Logan Sargent,
yeah,
who would not make it to Q2 in his home race. Then came Valtteri Bottas in the Alfa Romeo, and Bottas went up to P9. So that was
yeah,
a really good effort from Valtteri Bottas, and that pushed Piastri and Stroll down, and Sargent kept tumbling down the order, as then Sonoda came fifth, and Piastri though and Ocon were both still on laps. So Piastri went up to 10th, and then Esteban Ocon went up to 12th, and then we waited to see Fernando Alonso
yeah,
in his Aston Martin, and we all thought he would get through, but shockingly, Fernando Alonso could
yeah,
not get out of Q1, and so that was a really big disappointment from Aston
yeah,
Martin, as both cars were out in Q1, and it just shows sort of the progression but backwards that car has
yeah.
been going through.
Yeah, so that meant Ricardo barely snuck through into Q2, and all this time Lewis Hamilton was up there comfortably in P1. So that was very shocking to see, and Norris was up there in P2. So Verstappen was down in P3. So that was very surprising to see, and Verstappen was also 2 tenths back on Lewis Hamilton. But of course, it's just Q1, and we know Verstappen turns into a different man in Q3.
Exactly. So going into Q2 now, we saw towards the end, we saw Zhou Guanyu trying to improve his position. He
Yeah,
was currently 15th and the slowest out of those 15, but
yeah,
he went up into P9, and that for the moment he made him safe. But then Yuki Tsunoda came out of the final corner, and Tsunoda went up into ninth, so that pushed Zhou into the driver and risk zone. Bottas could not get out, and he stayed 13th. Lewis Hamilton, meanwhile, had flown through the first
yeah,
sector, as Gasly went up to fifth, and Hamilton across the line he went up to third fastest. Then George Russell, who wasn't having a very good lap, managed to find it together at
yeah,
the end and went up to P9. And Sergio Perez was the driver at risk, and Sonoda had been pushed down to
yeah.
Esteban Ocon. He was eighth, and he improved up to fifth, and so that was good for the Alpine drivers, but not good for the AlphaTauri drivers, as Sonoda was 11th and Ricciardo was 15th during his comeback, and also both Alfa Romeos were out in the end.
Yeah, so now moving on into Q3, after the first set of runs, it looked like Verstappen was going to be the quickest. As he crossed the line, he went up at to the top, but Leclerc was now coming through to complete his first lap of the session to see whether he could get provisional pole. And surprisingly, he did take provisional pole ahead of Verstappen by 3 tenths of a second. So it was a very good lap from Charles Leclerc, and he was looking pretty quick in the Ferrari. And then Lando Norris crossed the line to go up to third, but 7 tenths back on Max Verstappen. So he was third just because he was the third driver to cross the line. So others behind were certainly gonna set quicker lap times, including Carlos Sainz, who went up into P3. He was a tenth back on Verstappen. So far Leclerc was the man to beat.
Yeah, and then we saw a bunch of drivers coming and improving behind them. We saw George Russell in the
Yeah,
Mercedes then going up into fifth, followed by Sergio Perez, who then beat George Russell.
yeah,
Pierre Gasly had put in a really good lap to fourth fastest, as
yeah,
George Russell's lap time got deleted for track limits. And then we saw Lewis Hamilton go up to second fastest, just five
yeah,
thousandths behind, or 500ths behind Charles Leclerc. And we saw right at the final corner, we saw Max Verstappen get impeded. I think it was by his teammate to
Yeah.
Sergio Perez.
He got some of the dirty air coming off his teammates, so he was not happy about that at all.
Because that like pushed Verstappen a little bit wide, so he was not
Yeah.
happy about that. And that would increase tensions at Red Bull
Yeah.
at the moment, but ultimately it wouldn't affect them as they went into their last runs. So into the final runs, Leclerc
Yeah.
was the man to beat, and he extended his advantage by a tenth of a second.
Yeah.
And then we waited to see if Verstappen could improve, and we saw Verstappen chuck it into the penultimate corner, and that
Yeah.
sent him just a little bit wide through the right before the final corner, and
Yeah.
so he Verstappen still went up to first by 5 thousandths, but we waited to see whether that could possibly be
Yeah.
potential track limits as Esteban Ocon went up to sixth, and we got confirmation then that Max Verstappen had
Yeah.
exceeded track limits and his time would be deleted. So Verstappen went fell down the order to fifth,
Yeah.
and Lando Norris had put in a great time for second on the road, and we waited to see what Hamilton could do. Hamilton only stayed third ahead of Carlos Sainz. George Russell
Yeah.
only went up into fifth. So it was Charles Leclerc on pole, surprisingly for Ferrari, as they found pace right at the last moment.
Yeah, and so after Charles Leclerc, then it came Lando Norris, then Lewis Hamilton. So both the British drivers are up there in P2 and P3. And Lewis Hamilton once again extracting everything out of his Mercedes to be up there. Then Carlos Sainz, I think he would definitely be disappointed with that, only to be P4 while his teammates on pole. Then George Russell in fifth, and Max Verstappen is definitely not happy to be starting down in sixth. Then Gasly, Ocon, great from Alpine. Perez, poor qualifying from him, only in P9. And then Piastri down there in P10.
Yep.
So now moving on into the sprint shootout. This was qualifying on a Saturday to set the grid for the sprint race later that afternoon.
Yep. So going into the final runs of SQ2, we saw drivers or
SQ1.
SQ1
Yeah.
drivers were trying to improve their times. Kevin Magnussen, he couldn't get out of the bottom five, and he stayed 16th. Oscar Piastri was the driver at risk as Gasly
Yeah.
went up into 13th. Piastri went up to 14th, so it was a decent improvement, but not by much. Valtteri Bottas couldn't get out of the
Yeah.
bottom five. He stayed 17th. Logan Sargent in his home race, he only went up to P19 and ahead of Daniel Ricciardo, but Ricciardo crossed the line and he put his AlphaTauri out of the bottom five right at the line. So
Yeah.
Ricciardo was able to get into SQ2 and out qualify Yuki Tsunoda, who had a disastrous qualifying
Yeah.
SQ or sprint qualifying in P19.
Yeah, and Sonoda was not happy about that at all, I'm sure. And we also saw one of the Ferraris of Charles Leclerc get impeded by one of the Mercedes of George Russell right at the final corner. He was not happy about that at all. He was on the radio calling for a penalty for George Russell, but he still made it through in the end. So the five we lost from SQ1 were Hulkenberg, Magnussen, Bottas, Sonoda, and Sargent. Sargent once again in P20. So not at all a going well for him this weekend.
Exactly. So now going on into SQ2 now, and immediately or towards the final runs, we saw Verstappen
Yeah,
after being fastest, he had a spin. I think it was coming
the
near
same
where
place
Oscar
where
Piastri had
Piastri.
his
Yeah,
spin at turn 8 and turn 9.
yeah,
So Verstappen, if you saw, he just took too much inside curve once again and just looped his Red Bull
yeah,
around, and he did very well to keep it out of the wall. But
yeah,
that was a highly unusual error from Max Verstappen,
yeah,
especially after just winning the World Championship last
yeah.
weekend.
Yeah, so going now into the final set of runs, Verstappen was still the quickest man out there, and he was in the pit lane, not as to just not use another set of tires and save it up for SQ3. And so now we had drivers trying to improve from the bottom five, including Lewis Hamilton, who did very well yesterday, and he went up into P8, and surprisingly behind his teammate George Russell, but at least Hamilton was provisionally through. And Pierre Gasly was also one of those drivers who needed a time and needed to get into SQ3, and Gasly went up into P7, so it was a really good qualifying from him so far. And now Alex Albon would try to do everything he could to get his Williams into SQ3, and as he crossed the line, he just did into P10, but there was still one man who could deny him. there was multiple people who could deny him,
Yeah.
such as Zhou Guanyu. But Zhou Guanyu crossed the line, and he couldn't really do anything about it. He was down there in P14. So next it was up to see whether Daniel Ricciardo could put his AlphaTauri into SQ3 because Stroll had pit, so his session was done. And as Ricciardo crossed the line, he went up only into P11.
Yeah, it was a pretty good effort from Ricardo there to get right into P11, but ultimately he just couldn't
Yeah,
get past Alex Albon. But nevertheless, it was a really good effort from Ricardo. It was poor from Aston Martin as they
yeah,
both of them couldn't get into the third part of sprint qualifying. And we saw a replay of Stroll. He just completely
yeah,
double locked up and could not stop his car into turn 12, and so that cost him dear on his
yeah,
lap. And then Fernando Alonso was just struggling with his car, and so
yeah.
we lost Joe, Stroll, Ocon, Alonso, and Ricardo from SQ2.
Yeah, so now moving on into SQ3, going into the final set of runs, it was Verstappen who was looking like he was the quickest man out there. As he crossed the line, he extended his advantage at pole position, and next up was Lando Norris to see whether he could deny Max Verstappen. And as Lando Norris crossed the line, he went up only into P2. So all these drivers setting their first times of the session with just like under a minute left to go. So all of these drivers waiting it to the very end, and Norris only went up into P second, a tenth back from Max Verstappen. And next up, as Oscar Piastri crossed the line, he went up into P3, 2 tenths back on his teammate, 3 tenths back on his teammate, Lando Norris, and or 2 tenths off Norris, 3 tenths off Max Verstappen. And next up came the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc to see whether he could take pole position, and no, he couldn't. He only went up into P2.
Yeah, so Leclerc went up into P2 by just 5 hundredths of a second. He
Yeah,
missed out. And then we saw Carlos Sainz in the second Ferrari coming towards the line as Alex Albon went up into fifth place in the
yeah,
Williams. And Sainz chucked it through the final corner and he only went up into fifth fastest. So Sainz was once again way off his teammate.
yeah,
Sergio Perez went up to P6, but we know Perez is way off his teammate.
yeah,
Then Lewis Hamilton came up across the line. Hamilton went up to third fastest, and George Russell then he went a little bit wide at the penultimate corner, but that didn't cost him. But
yeah,
Russell went up only into P8, and so
yeah,
it was disastrous from George Russell, because especially considering where Hamilton was. So
yeah,
both at Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes were the teammates separated by a lot. But in the end,
yeah.
it was Max Verstappen on pole for SQ for the sprint race.
Yeah. So the final top 10 order for the sprint race were Verstappen was on pole, Leclerc was second, Hamilton third, Norris fourth, then came Piastri, Sainz, Perez, Russell, Albon, and then Pierre Gasly completing the top 10.
So going on into the sprint now, this would be the first out of two
Yeah.
races that we would have this weekend, and we would wait to see whether Leclerc could possibly get the jump on
Yeah.
Verstappen into turn one.
Yeah, so as the lights went out for the sprint race, it looked to be a good start from Leclerc, but then Verstappen used that pole position advantage to just cut across Leclerc, but Leclerc was not backing out and he was just sneaking up the inside, and both of them were nearly on the grass, and Verstappen just tried to hold it around the outside, and Leclerc tried to get that switch back, but Verstappen was just ahead at the moment, and we could see now Leclerc was under pressure from Lewis Hamilton, and Hamilton had actually snuck through up into P2, and Hamilton and Leclerc were now wheel to wheel going into the S section, but Hamilton just barely was ahead and stayed ahead. So it was Verstappen from Hamilton, then came Leclerc, Norris, then Sainz, then Piastri.
Yeah, and they plunged down towards the hill, and
Yeah,
Perez was still behind both McLarens and Carlos Sainz. And
yeah,
we saw now, before the straight, we saw Alex Albon trying to get past one of the Alpines. I think it was Pierre
yeah,
Gasly, and there was lots of fight behind them. It was three wide between both Aston Martins and the
yeah,
house of Nico Hulkenberg. And so Alonso was staying ahead of them, and we saw Perez trying to attack Oscar Piastri
yeah,
as Carlos Sainz went down the inside of Lando Norris and into turn 12, and then we saw Sergio Perez trying to get past Oscar Piastri into turn 13, but Piastri did well to hold off Sergio Perez. And then going on into lap 2 is when the action really
yeah,
unfolded as Sergio Perez tried to go around the outside again of Oscar Piastri, and Perez got forced off the track by the
yeah,
Australian, and Piastri was doing really well to keep ahead of Sergio Perez, and Perez couldn't find his way back. And Perez tried it again on lap 3,
Yeah,
but again Oscar Piastri broke very late. But Perez this time got the switchback, and Piastri ultimately had to concede the
yeah,
position into turn 13. But it was really good defense from Piastri, and that put him ultimately under pressure from George Russell as they
yeah,
started to go through the long double right hander or triple right hander of turn 16, 17, and 18, and Russell made a really nice move down the
yeah.
inside at all three of those corners.
Yeah, that was cool to see between Russell and Piastri. Of course, both of them are F3 and F2 winners back to back in their rookie years. So both of them providing really good racing between each other. And moving on to lap 5 now, we saw Pierre Gasly make his way past Oscar Piastri into turn 1, and Piastri would try to fight him back going into the S section, but Gasly had the move done, and he just sent it up the inside of Piastri. I don't think Piastri expected Gasly to come down there, so that was very opportunistic from Gasly. As then we saw George Russell receive a 5 second
Yeah.
penalty for overtaking off the track.
Yeah, so he got the penalty for overtaking
Yeah,
Oscar Piastri off the track.
yeah. And moving on into lap 10 now, we saw the McLaren of Lando Norris putting pressure on his former teammate Carlos Sainz. He had DRS behind his teammate on lap 10 of 19, and Norris was going wheel to wheel with Carlos Sainz, and he made the move into at the end of that long back straight. But then Sainz tried to get the switchback on Norris, but Norris just stayed ahead. And moving on into lap 11 now. This time, Sainz was now being put under pressure from Sergio Perez, and Perez was just able to brake so much later and put the power on so much better than the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz. Going down that long back straight, even before they reached the braking zone, Perez was ahead and up into fifth place.
Yeah, it was a nice move from Perez, and he needed to get that done
Yeah,
quickly if he wanted to get after Lando Norris.
yeah,
So going on to lap 14, though, George Russell was all over the back of Carlos Sainz, and into turn 1, Russell made a nice move down the inside, but Sainz was able to get the switchback at turn 1 because it's a
yeah,
pretty narrow hairpin, so the switchback works really
yeah,
well there, and Carlos Sainz was able to hold off Russell into the S section.
yeah,
But and then we on to lap 17, we saw Lance Stroll had to retire from the sprint because of
yeah.
issues with his car. It was most likely the brakes on Stroll's car because they'd been struggling with that all weekend.
Yeah, what a shame for Aston Martin not having a good weekend at all.
Yeah.
But going on into the final lap and lap 19, Max Verstappen had absolutely dominated this sprint race out in front, and he comfortably won the sprint in the USA and 9 seconds ahead of Lewis Hamilton. So it was a great result for him and Red Bull. And Hamilton came home now to finish in P2 and claim that second place in the sprint race. Then came Charles Leclerc to complete the podium places, just 8 tenths ahead of Lando Norris.
It was a really good drive from Lando Norris and as well both McLarens too because while they probably weren't as high up as they wanted to,
Yeah.
they showed really strong pace and showed really good overtaking and defending.
Yeah, and then behind them, we saw now George Russell giving it everything to try to get past Carlos Sainz right at the line, but Russell just came home in P7, which would then become P8 because of his time penalty, and Gasly moved up into P7 then. And farther back, we saw Gasly's teammate Ocon being put under immense pressure from Daniel Ricciardo as they raced to the line, and Ricciardo just missed out on P11. So Russell completed the points playing position ahead of then Albon and Piastri to complete the top 10.
So it was a really exciting sprint race, and it
Yeah,
would show us exactly what entertainment we would get in
yeah.
the actual race on Sunday.
Yeah, so now moving on into the main Grand Prix with Norris on the front row and Leclerc on pole position, it will be an exciting race down to turn one. So as the lights went out, it was a great start there from Lando Norris and great start from Hamilton farther back. Leclerc was being put under pressure immediately, and farther back we could see Carlos Sainz, who had an electric start as well, trying to go down the inside of Hamilton, who was already on the inside of Leclerc, and into turn one. Norris took the lead of the race. Leclerc was in second. Then Sainz came through ahead of Hamilton, and Verstappen farther back was now trying to pass Lewis Hamilton, but Hamilton slammed the door shut on Max Verstappen. So through the S's, it was Norris from Leclerc, Sainz, Hamilton. Then came Verstappen, then Piastri, and then Ocon.
Yeah, it was a great start from Lando Norris because he was already building a
Yeah,
lead towards in front of Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz had got a really good start because he was
yeah,
now right behind Charles Leclerc as they approached the long back
yeah,
straight. And further back, we saw one of the Alpines. It was Esteban Ocon getting ahead of George Russell. I think
yeah,
it was at turn 11, and so it was a really nice move from Ocon. But that would
yeah,
put him under immense pressure all the way down the back straight, as then we saw Oscar Piastri trying to look around the outside of Max Verstappen into
yeah.
turn 12. Verstappen went a little bit wide, but Piastri couldn't do anything with it.
Yeah, then we saw at the end of the long back straight, we saw Sainz went dive to the inside of his teammate Charles Leclerc, and both Ferraris were now just squabbling with each other, and that's not what they needed because that allowed Hamilton to close up and Norris to just fly away. But out into lap three, then we saw Sergio Perez now tried to go down the inside of Esteban Ocon, but he had to just keep his moment and wait his time because Ocon was putting the pressure on George Russell and DRS was unable, so they were now flying towards the down the long back straight and into that heavy braking zone, and we saw Russell was ahead of Ocon, and then Perez went to the inside of Ocon, so it was a nice move to pick off Ocon for Perez.
Yup, now going on to lap 4 already, we saw some great overtaking, but there was more to come. As on
Yeah,
lap 4, we saw Lewis Hamilton into turn 12 go
yeah,
down the inside of Carlos Sainz to put his Mercedes up into third place.
yeah,
And it was a really important move from Hamilton if he wanted to get
yeah,
onto the podium this afternoon. And going on to lap 5, it was a similar move for Verstappen on Carlos Sainz,
yeah,
as Verstappen lunged his Red Bull into turn 12 and he put his car ahead of Carlos
yeah,
Sainz. And again, it was deja vu for Lewis Hamilton on lap 6, but this time he went around the outside of Charles Leclerc into turn 12, and Leclerc tried to fight back.
yeah,
Leclerc will brake late to try to fight back, but ultimately he couldn't brake late enough for Lewis Hamilton. And then on lap 7, they had to retire Esteban Ocon after
yeah.
his damage at turn 1 with Oscar Piastri.
Yeah, so not at all what Ocon and Alpine needed after they were doing pretty well throughout this weekend, Alpine. So for them to retire in the main Grand Prix is not at all what they needed.
Exactly.
But Oscar Piastri's McLaren was also damaged too on lap 10. We saw him slowing down and he also had to come in and pit to retire.
Yeah, so that would allow Ricardo to go up into the points positions as
Yeah.
Piastri retired. And then we saw on lap 11, we saw Max Verstappen trying to lunge down the inside of Leclerc into
Yeah.
turn 12. Leclerc and Verstappen going wheel to wheel is great entertainment because Leclerc
Yeah.
will squeeze you out, and he tried to squeeze Verstappen out. But ultimately, Leclerc went off the track, and
Yeah.
Verstappen was able to go around the outside of
Yeah.
turn 13 and 14, and Leclerc, but then that put him on the inside line for turn 15, and
Yeah.
Leclerc tried to switch back into turn 16, but ultimately Verstappen held the position firmly ahead of Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, so going on to lap 17 now, Max Verstappen came into the pits and changed onto the medium set of tires to see he boxed first, and Sainz went through, Leclerc went through, so all of them were now waiting. And on lap 21 now, we saw Lewis Hamilton make his pit stop from it was I think P2, so he made his pit stop on lap 21, and he went onto the hard compounded tires. So different strategies going on.
Yep, he came out again behind Max Verstappen, and on lap 28 we saw Verstappen overtake race leader Lando Norris into turn 12, and Norris tried to fight back into turn 13. So that was the typical thing. If you got overtaken at turn
Yeah,
12, you could still try and fight back into turn 13. But again, Verstappen held off Lando Norris, and Norris then ultimately came into the
yeah.
pits on lap 35 to get rid of those hard tires, and he put on a new set of, it was medium tires.
Medium. I think it was,
No, it was
yeah,
another set of
hard
hard tires
tires. Yeah,
for Lando Norris, and he came out behind Charles Leclerc. So Norris was in fifth or sixth place, and we again saw on lap 36 Max Verstappen make his second and final pit
yeah.
stop.
And now going on to he came out behind the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc and just ahead of the McLaren of Lando Norris. So Verstappen, and also we saw Sainz come into the pit lane that same lap as well. But on lap 38 now, we saw Carlos Sainz make his way past George Russell and move up into P5. So Russell now was falling through the order, and Sainz on the hard tires was starting to gain positions. And moving on to lap 39, Hamilton came into the pits again for his second stop, and we saw Hamilton would come out behind both Leclerc and Verstappen, and then we saw Verstappen dive to the inside of Charles Leclerc to now take the lead of the U.S. Grand Prix on lap 39.
Yep, going on also onto lap 39, we saw Lando Norris trying to dive his way down the inside of Charles Leclerc
Yeah,
into turn 12, and again we saw another driver get picked off at turn 12. Leclerc
yeah.
couldn't hold off Lando Norris, and again on lap 43, Leclerc could not hold off Lewis Hamilton as into turn 12, Hamilton put his Mercedes up into the podium positions.
Yeah, so Lewis Hamilton once again in the U.S. is putting on a show, and we know how well he is and how well he goes around the circuit. But we also saw now Fernando Alonso making his way past Yuki Tsunoda, and both the Aston Martins now trying to pick their way back through the field. And both of them were on lap 48, were running in the points. As then we saw Lance Stroll make his way past Yuki Tsunoda and into P10.
Yeah, we saw Stroll trying to fight Yuki Tsunoda, and he was complaining about how Tsunoda was moving
Yeah,
late, and that was pretty dangerous. And going on to lap 49, we saw another late move from Lando Norris into
yeah,
turn one, and Norris tried to squeeze out Lewis Hamilton into the inside,
yeah.
and Hamilton let Norris go wide, and Hamilton then got the switch back into turn one,
Yeah,
and that put Hamilton up into second place, and that shows the experience between a man who has won 103 Grand Prix
yeah.
versus a man who hasn't won any Grand Prix.
And moving on to lap 50 now, we saw a swap at Ferrari as Sainz went to the inside of Leclerc and moved up into P4. And then on lap 51, they had to retire Fernando Alonso from the race. So Alonso, who was running in the points, had to retire, and Aston Martin's weekend just continued to get worse and worse.
As we saw Ricardo take the fastest lap
Yeah,
that lap, but he was running last on the soft tires because his strategy
yeah.
hadn't worked out for him.
Yeah, and moving on to lap 53 now, we saw a battle between Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. Perez got a nice switchback at turn one and was able to just drive off into the distance ahead of Charles Leclerc. So Perez was now up into fifth. Yeah, and moving on into lap 56 then, and the final lap, Max Verstappen had absolutely controlled this race from the start, and he came through to win the U.S. Grand Prix for the third year in a row in the United States in Austin, Texas. And Lewis Hamilton picked up another podium in at Coda, and then Lando Norris came home to finish in P3. So another very well driven race from Lando Norris. Then Sainz came home to finish in P4 ahead of Perez, Leclerc, Russell, Gasly, Stroll, and Sonoda
And
to complete the top 10.
Sonoda had also gotten the fastest lap of the race, so it was two crucial points for Alpha Tauri as they
Yeah,
tried to move up the order. And also throughout this whole race, we saw the Williams pair had
yeah,
slowly fought their way back up through the field, and Alex Albon was 11th. We expected a high result from
yeah,
him, but Logan Sargent was right behind his
yeah.
teammate in P12. So that was a really good drive from Sargent at his home race.
Yeah, and so after the race, what we saw after the race was there was two incidents between two drivers being brought to the stewards. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton's floors were suspected to be illegal because of like the height of them. So they brought it to the stewards, and the stewards did deem that the floors were illegal because of the height I think it was of it. So like how
It was
high
just the
up?
skid marks, though.
Oh, is the skid marks of the floor?
Yeah, it was like the skid boards on the bottom of the car. They found out that there were skid marks in areas that there shouldn't be, and
Mm,
it could potentially be dangerous, and so that's why the FIA are strict about that. So they found
yeah,
those floorboards to be illegal. So both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc's cars ended up getting disqualified from the race.
yeah, and so this disqualification meant obviously they would be dropped from the results. So the final results were Max Verstappen won the race, then Lando Norris finished second, Carlos Sainz ended up taking a podium, then came Sergio Perez in fourth, then Russell was fifth, then Gasly sixth, Stroll 7th, Sonoda 8th, Albon up into the P9, and then Logan Sargent completed the top 10 in P10. So Logan Sargent, for the first time in his career, scored points in Formula One, and what a place to do it. Yeah, exactly.
Unbelievable for Sargent.
Yeah,
What a turnaround for him,
yeah,
especially to do it at his home race. And this is exactly what he needs if he wants to
yeah.
keep his seat in Formula One.
It's just 1 point, but 1 point can often mean so much to someone, especially Sargent, who's been struggling so much this season. And for him to finally get that point, we will see now whether that could unlock new potential inside him and see if he could continue delivering results like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's it for this United States Grand Prix. And thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast. And be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2023 Mexico City Grand Prix. Thank you.